Okay, how many takes is it going to take us to start this episode?
I don't know, but I guess we're going to find out.
We always do this thing where we start and we're like, hey, and then we look at each other and we're like, we have to do that again.
Or we're fumbling over our words. We're like, wait, how do we want to start this?
Yeah.
How do you do this?
But this is going okay.
This is going fine, actually. I'm Mylene.
And I'm Michael, and we're on the grad school journey to becoming licensed therapists.
Come with us to class as we discuss and dissect all we can learn about mental health, relationships, therapy techniques, and everything in between.
With your two favorite therapists in training, this is Therapy in Progress.
Hey.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm exhausted, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
It's been a crazy week. It was my birthday. I moved to a new city, essentially. I moved into the valley. So it's been a lot going on, but happy to be back at the pod.
Yay.
How about you? Big week for you, too.
This week was also very busy for me.
Yeah.
I started my practicum.
Huge. So for listeners who may or may not remember, practicum is the part of our program where you kind of go out into the world while you're still in school and you are actually training on site with real clients.
Yes.
But you're still in school and you're still being supervised, obviously.
Yeah.
So what happened? You got matched and placed, and like what's going on?
Yeah, so you have to apply to sites just like you would any other job. The interview process is interesting, though. They're looking at more of who you are as a person and if you fit culturally in their site, and of course your competence, more than they are about any kind of accolades that you've had in the past.
Sure.
So it's an interesting process, but I finally...
Are you saying that my Nobel Prize is not going to help me during the practicum process?
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, why did I even get it then?
Maybe for your doctorate.
Okay, perfect.
But yeah, so I finally got my site. So they called me up. They offered me a place. So I was like, amazing, let's get started. And they were like, can you start next week? And I was like, oh, yeah, let's go. So I started training. So I don't actually get to see clients until I'm in the practicum class, which starts at the end of this month.
Which is so soon.
It's so soon. It's moving so quickly because I didn't think I was going to be able to start until the fall. So this is...
You're going to be sitting with clients this month.
This month.
That makes the whole thing seem so different and like more real. Because as we've talked about, I'm on a different track than you time-wise, so I'm planning to start the application process this fall. So I will be, 6 months or so behind you. And so I've kind of felt like I still have this like safety, like little buffer because it's like still like, oh, I'm kicking that can down the road. But like, it's time for you.
No, it's go time.
It's go time.
We're doing it.
How do you feel?
I'm really excited because this is what I've been working so hard for. Right. And at the same time, I'm nervous because I don't know what I don't know until I'm there.
Yeah.
I know how I am in role plays with my peers. I know how I am with my friends, but that's totally different than actually sitting in a room with a client.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how that goes. And I'm consuming even more content than I was before, trying to figure out how can I be the best therapist that I can be right now.
I can't wait to hear. That's going to be so exciting.
Yeah.
All right. What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about men's mental health.
Yes, an important topic.
Very important topic, and it's one that's not talked about as often.
Yeah. And even lately, I think maybe more so than it used to be, which is nice. But even still, I think there is a lot of misconception about it. For example, this idea that like men's mental health is looked over or looked at differently because societally men are expected to like not open up about things, or it's considered not manly, whatever that means, to like express emotions, things like that. People this day and age might think, oh, that's not true anymore. Come on, that's old news. But if you do the research, still the first thing that pops up every single time you're looking at any source about why do men suffer in mental health, the answer first and foremost is always because societally it is not valued, it is not considered appropriate, that is still, like men, as far as I'm aware, brain structure-wise, are not more predisposed to mental health conditions than women are. So clearly something's going on. Something
is going on. And I think it's really important to look at the history. How is it that we got here? What is it about stigmas towards men and masculinity that are causing men to not seek out mental health or social support in the same ways that women are, and therefore are not getting the help that they need and deserve?
Yeah. We'll go into stats and stuff all throughout this episode, but a big statistic that is often cited, men are, in the United States, are 4 times more likely to die from suicide, and yet men are only half as likely to seek mental health care.
Yep.
So that disparity is very large.
Huge.
you know?
Not to mention that men are 2 to 3 times more likely to have substance abuse issues than women are.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that too. There are specific disorders that are more common in men, certain things that go underreported or under less noticed because they present differently. Absolutely. Okay, so you want to talk a little history, how we got here?
Yeah, so I want to talk about how we got here. So there's Virginia Satir, and she wrote this amazing book and has done a lot of research in.
Fun fact about Virginia Satir.
Let's hear it.
Do you know this? So Virginia Satir is like the mother of what has become family therapy. She was at my parents' wedding.
What?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah, apparently they really needed early couple counseling. No, I'm kidding. No, she was a very close colleague of my grandfather.
Wow.
My grandfather was a psychiatrist, and he and Virginia Satir and Don Jackson and a handful of others were among the founding members of the MRI, the Medical Research Institute in Northern California.
Wow.
And they worked very closely together, and she was over at the house and at the wedding, and so actually
Your grandpa's in one of our textbooks.
he is in one of our textbooks. A friend of ours sent me a screenshot and was like, "Is this your grandpa?" Which was pretty cool. Sorry, that was just a family tangent, but yes, Virginia Satir.
Yes. So she's the mother of family therapy, and she looked at how gender roles were shifting, even back in the day. So when we're looking at masculinity and our definition of it today, it has shifted from even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but even in the 80s, in the 70s, it was different. So it's really a malleable identity to be masculine.
Yeah, like what does that even mean?
What does it mean? So there are a lot of different historical and cultural influences on what it meant to be masculine. And post World War II, there was a particular role that men felt like they had to embody, which was this more machismo, like leader of the family, head of household, stoic version of masculinity. But coming today with the different waves of feminism, it has kind of shifted to be less of an expectation about men being the breadwinners, to be the provider, to be the protector, and more about being able to show up in a compassionate, emotional way, heightening your emotional intelligence more than valuing your intellectual intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, I found, speaking of that, an excerpt of something that Virginia Satir had actually written in the 80s about this very thing, as looking back as to the women's rights movement and as feminism was growing. So she says, talking about the male and female relationship here, she says, quote, "The end of the dominant/submissive model in relationships was in sight. However, there was very little that had developed to replace the old pattern, so couples floundered. New forms for the new values had not yet emerged, and the old ones were no longer acceptable. Old role definitions were no longer appropriate, and chaos was setting in." So this is Virginia Satir herself, end quote. This was her talking about how, as new understandings of what women could do were emerging, this kind of pushed aside the old expectations of like what a man was supposed to do, but there was no new understanding yet.
Right. So while in the past women were expected to be more submissive, to be at home, to take on roles of child rearing, nurturing, housekeeping, when we started to become more educated and go out to the workforce and be more career driven and more independent, it impacted men in terms of role confusion. Yeah. Now they were like, okay, our whole role was to go out and to provide and to protect, but now it seems like you don't need us in that way. So what is our role in relationships? What is our role in society?
And this goes back way even further to before society as we know it, when we were cavemen, right? There is a biological difference between how males of the species and females of the species developed into their roles, because biologically men were better suited physically to go out and hunt and run and chase down things, whereas women biologically were better suited to bear children and stay home to nurture and feed the children. So it's like before we had language even, when we were in our most primitive states, like this is how what we might now call gender roles developed. It was biologically based.
It begs the question, how much of it is nature, how much of it is nurture? Because there are biological features and influences that lead us to take up certain roles. But how much of that is biological and how much of it is social influence?
In my opinion, it started biological and then became such the norm for so many societies over so many thousands of years that it became more culturally and cognitively based, when maybe it started as a biological logic.
Yeah.
So how do you think that now bleeds into this more modern understanding that we're talking about in terms of mental health, where men stereotypically aren't supposed to appear sensitive or emotional or vulnerable in that way. I'm curious why those two things equate. Why does that traditional masculinity have to go hand in hand with this idea of like, don't ask for help or show any vulnerability? Like, why, you know?
Yeah. So often we associate masculinity with stoicism, with strength, with independence, not needing anybody at all. So when we're looking at people who are trying to embody this masculine role, if you are strong and you are independent, you don't need anybody, and you're a lone wolf and you're all productive and strong, and it's not conducive to asking for help and for admitting fault or weakness, where vulnerability, it's a misnomer, is seen as weakness. To say, I'm not feeling right, or I'm having these certain thoughts and I need help, a lot of masculine people are going to equate that with admitting weakness or that they need somebody else, which somehow impedes on their identity of masculine.
It's so true that we're getting it wrong before we even start, which is the fact that like feeling emotions is a weakness. That's like the underlying understanding here, which isn't true, or at least shouldn't be. You know, it shouldn't be true that, because it's just part of the human experience to be sad or afraid or frustrated, whatever it might be. And it's interesting to me, and this has been talked about a lot, that the only acceptable emotion for men to show is aggression or anger.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk about this later in the episode, but how that manifests and how does men's mental health affect the people in their lives, like their partners.
Yeah.
When the only outlet they have for any negative emotion they might be feeling is to funnel it through anger or aggression, that's not going to be very good or productive for themselves or anyone around them.
Right.
But aggression and anger is kind of like the strength version of an emotion. So that's the one that is okay to be shown.
Yeah. I was actually talking about this exact topic last night with one of my friends. And he was saying how with his wife, they're going through a lot of personal issues right now, just externally from them. And he was saying that he could only experience two emotions. He's either happy, jolly, or like mad and frustrated. He's like, there is no in between. He's like, I don't ever feel sad. It's just either anger or frustration, or I'm happy. And that's it. And I was like, okay, do you think there could be anything underneath that anger that you might be experiencing?
It's so true.
And he was like, no. He was like, no, there's nothing underneath it. And I was like, okay, well, sometimes our anger can be a mask. It's an emotion that we use to mask maybe the more deep emotions that we don't want to address. And I was like, could it be fear? Could it be shame? He ended up texting me this morning.
Oh?
He was like, I actually reflected on what you said, that maybe the root of it could be fear. And he's like, it's something that I'm going to talk to my wife about now, so that maybe she can understand that I'm not mad at her. I'm scared about our situation.
Changing lives left and right. Look at you. It's so true, though, because anger, in a way, is less scary to feel than something like vulnerability or embarrassment. Embarrassment, that's a huge one. People feel shamed or embarrassed, and then they lash out in anger.
Yeah.
Because that is a more safe response.
If all these other feelings are considered weakness, shame, embarrassment, and fear, especially fear,
Sadness,
anxiety, nervousness, if those are harder to address, and those are the emotions that when we do express them, they're met culturally with man up, then, and the only form of emotion that you're allowed to express freely is anger and frustration, because that's seen as some kind of strength. Of course, that's what you're going to default to.
Yeah.
But it separates us from the emotions that we're actually feeling. We can't recognize the other feelings that we have if we are constantly defaulting to anger.
And if you're not recognizing them and therefore attending to them, they're going to fester out of your awareness and just continue to cause you problems.
Yeah.
Because as we've talked about earlier, the only way to really move through unpleasant feelings is to be aware of them and work with them and learn to tolerate them. And you have to be aware of them in order to do that.
Yeah.
You know?
I would challenge some people who notice that they do always default to anger, maybe recognize in themselves like, yeah, I do get angry. I don't really get sad or these other emotions. It's just straight to anger. I would challenge them to notice where it is that they're feeling that emotion.
I can even speak to personal experience when I was living in New York and I was really unhappy for a long time, going through a hard time. I am not an angry person. I'm a very chill, like gentle kind of guy, right?
Yeah.
But I was working a stressful job. I was stressed in the city. For the first and only time in my life, there was a long period of a few months where I was having anger problems. It was so weird. And I wasn't angry at anything per se, but that's how it was bubbling up. My temper was short. I was impatient. I was irritable, which also, side note, are, symptoms of depression, but that's for another time. But I noticed, I was like, what is going on with me? Why? Because I know I'm going through it. I know there's other stuff going on, but why is that manifesting in me, like, being angry at things?
Yeah.
I guess we're saying because that is, even if subconsciously, even if I'm not someone who I would say normally subscribes to those kinds of masculinity stereotypes, it still was ingrained in me. That's how it came out. That's how it manifested.
Did you notice that it was it a masking, or was there something underneath that anger, or did you?
Oh yeah, it was everything I was going through at the time. It was my unhappiness, it was my exhaustion, it was everything.
Was it easier to be angry than to address the underlying emotions?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it was more readily available to have that be the reaction than to really do the work, which I did later when, by the way, when I moved back to California and got back into therapy. But yeah, it's really interesting. Can we get into a little bit of some stats about mental health for men?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. So there was a study from earlier this year, actually, in January.
Really recent.
Yeah, that was looking at men and women in terms of who they go to for help or how likely they are to ask for support. And it's pretty stark. There's a difference when asked about how likely are you to go to a friend for support. 54% of women said yes, we would. Only 38% of men said that they would go to a friend for help.
It's a big difference.
For family members, would you go to a family member? This was even fewer men. 44% of women said yes, I would go to a family member. Only 26% of men said that they would.
Interesting.
So there's something going on. There is a difference in, I don't know if it's the expectation or the comfort level or the social acceptability of it, but a lot fewer men than women will go to people in their life when they are struggling and need support.
There's also something to be said about how women typically have stronger networks of support.
Yes, exactly. There was another study I'm looking at. This is from the Survey Center on American Life, where they were talking about the size of people's support systems and social networks. This is from a couple of years ago. The friendship decline, it says friendship decline more pronounced among men. So in the 90s, 40% of men said that they had 10 or more close friends. Now, in the 2020s, that has gone from 40% to 15% of men say that they have 10 or more close friendships.
How many does a typical man this day and age have?
The majority in 2021, the highest percentage is something around in the middle where it says 3 close friends is the majority of answers.
So it went from over 10 to 3.
Yeah. So something is shrinking in men's social circles. And I think it goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about the previous study, that emotional connection, that vulnerability, that ability to create bonds with each other. And the proof has been shown again and again that isolation, loneliness is like one of the biggest predictors for mental health struggles.
Right.
For depression, for suicide attempts.
Substance use.
For substance abuse. If you feel isolated and you feel like you don't have a support network, that is a huge risk factor for a whole host of mental health problems.
Yeah.
And one other thing I want to hit is that sometimes the presentations of certain mental health conditions or disorders are very different in men. And so sometimes they get overlooked, sometimes they are not noticed. For example, a big one is eating disorders.
Right.
1 in 4 diagnosed eating disorders is a man. 25% of eating disorders. I think that's a lot higher than people think.
Absolutely.
Because it looks different than what we might think the stereotypical eating disorder looks like. For example, bulimia in the DSM, one of the criteria is you have those compulsive compensating behaviors to counteract weight gain. A lot of people, when they hear that, the thing that we think of most often is purging after eating.
Right.
But another thing listed as a possibility is excessive exercise.
Right.
Compulsive exercise that is coming from a fear of gaining weight or a fear of body image, things like that, is also considered a presentation of bulimia if it goes hand in hand with other criteria as well.
I mean, if you just think about social media, this is particularly a problem that I've noticed with younger men and particularly adolescent boys is on social media, they see a lot of these men online getting really, really big, really, really strong, and they want to look like that. So they get incredibly strict on not just their diet, but on their workout regimen. Right. So it becomes this terror about looking a certain way and being able to hold that particular physique.
Yeah. And again, as with all things in mental health, like we're not saying that like a gym bro who watches what he eats and goes to the gym every day has bulimia. Like that's not the case.
Right.
But if you do have the pathology, we can go over eating disorders at some time in the future, but if you're engaging in binge eating behaviors and then to compensate for that, you are overly concerned in a debilitating way about your physical image, and so you're compulsively exercising or purging or whatever it is. Those are what we're talking about. So yeah. So fear not, gym bros. We're not saying that there's anything inherently wrong. But
you do hear people talking about body dysphoria or dysmorphia a lot in those circles. And I wonder how much of that is disordered and not just, a funny joke.
That's a good point. You had said in your last point, we were talking about masculinity. Do you remember, this was a while ago, we were talking one day, we were on campus, and we were discussing traditional masculinity and how we weren't satisfied with that stereotypical definition of it because it's outdated, it's unfair, it's, preventing men from seeking help.
Right.
What do you think a more modern or appropriate definition of masculinity would be?
So when I'm thinking about a more modern idea of what masculinity is, it can still be a protector, it can still be a provider, it could still be a procreator, but it needs to be less rigid. It can be more flexible, there can be more compassion. There's a lot of strength in vulnerability and being able to connect with people in that way, to be able to identify how is it that I'm feeling and be able to convey that to other people, and also to be able to recognize what those emotions are in other people so that you can protect them and be there for them and support them.
I think there's a confidence in that. If you are able to identify and express what's going on with you, which traditionally has been seen as not manly, I think it's confidence. And it's a self-possession, that you can be aware and open about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
One of our professors was talking about a client that she had who was a very adventurous skier, and he would do crazy things and go on the mountain and be so brave. And then he would come into session and have horrible anxiety and be too afraid to confront it. And she would say to him, "Where is the guy who was on the ski mountain yesterday, who was so fearless and so willing to throw yourself into the unknown? Where is that guy now when you're running away from your emotions? Bring back Ski Dude."
What did he say?
That became a shorthand for them. She said to this day they still reference Ski Dude together when he needs to remind himself that bravery can exist in the therapy room too. It's funny, it's like perhaps stereotypically men participate in dangerous, extreme activities, but then are too afraid to confront their own feelings.
Yeah.
It's such an irony. So we've touched on it, but can we go a little bit deeper in how does this affect the people around the men?
Yeah.
Their children, their significant others. What is this doing to relationships?
Because our current understanding of being masculine does not include feeling our emotions. In fact, quite the opposite. It's suppressing our emotions. It leads to breakdowns in communication, and it could lead to relationship dissatisfaction because men disproportionately rely on women to get their emotional needs met.
And the man who is relying so heavily on his female partner for any kind of emotional support, and yet not being able to express that to her, just needing it and expecting it and wanting it so badly, but not being able to identify, hey, this is what I need from you in terms of support, that's going to create a lot of relationship breakdown.
For sure.
When you sweep things under the rug, you end up with a lumpy rug and somebody trips and twists their ankle. I'm paraphrasing that from Modern Family. But it's so true. It's that's why a lot of women report dissatisfaction in the communication in their relationship with their male partner, because things get swept under the rug and things get suppressed. And when that happens, that thing doesn't disappear. It's still there. It's just now causing resentment and frustration, and it ends up being a bigger issue and a bigger strain on the relationship itself.
The fear here, because there is this lone wolf mentality in men that they shouldn't need anybody or they shouldn't rely on anybody, it makes it really hard to say, I don't want to come across needy.
Yeah.
And am I...
Like a man can't say that.
Right.
You know, I want you to pay more attention to me. I want you to compliment me. Men never get complimented.
That's another whole thing. Men never get complimented. They also get far less hugs than women do, which, I mean, that's a problem in and of itself because hugs are so important for our emotional well-being.
Yeah.
When you hug somebody, it's releasing certain chemicals in your brain. It's oxytocin, it's dopamine, it's serotonin, which are, you know, they're associated with the happy chemicals. It helps you to relieve a lot of stress. So even just hugs could be really impactful.
Yeah, I love that. Hug people, everyone.
Yeah, go out and hug a guy.
I'm also thinking of men's relationship with their children. If it's modeled to, say a man has a son, if it's modeled that emotional expression is not the way to go, or that anger is the way to go, or that, you know, et cetera, what we've been talking about, then the cycle continues.
It does.
Because subconsciously, children adopt what they are modeled from their parents. So if a young man is learning from his father, from his male role model, that this is how you handle or don't handle your emotions, that subconsciously works into the fabric of what that child is going to be like once they're grown.
Right.
Unless they do their own work and, you know, untangle it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's so easy for the cycle to continue.
Because that's how you learn how to be a man in our society is through, you know, that male role model in your life. There's also a big problem.
Connecting this, do you think the reason I'm sitting here in this field is because my grandfather was a psychiatrist and it's been passed down through my family that, like, this type of thing is of value, maybe?
It's definitely a contributing factor.
Yeah.
There's for sure an influence.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So can we move into now the positive side of this? Is that I think the conversation is opening up. I think people are becoming more aware. Not enough, because still it's the number one thing keeping men from treatment is the social stigma and the societal understanding that it's not manly, right? But slowly that conversation is starting to open up. And I think also it matters talking about therapy. Going into therapy, especially in the beginning, if it's somebody who's new or a man who's new to it or maybe might be uncomfortable with it, therapy can look different in the beginning. You know, if you take a more solution-focused approach in the beginning, if men in a therapy room are a little bit afraid of diving into the feelings, right? You can tackle thoughts, cognitive thoughts. You can talk, and I'm not saying that the feelings aren't important. You will get there, but there is a way in if it's somebody new to the process.
I think that's also why men are more drawn to coaching rather than therapy. Because it feels more directive. It's also kind of associated with sports, like the idea of having a coach versus having a therapist.
Interesting. Almost just the semantics of it are different. So they see a lot that men come into therapy when a crisis has happened, when they have lost someone or in a job transition or when there's an acute problem that they need help with. Women in larger numbers tend to go into therapy for preventative care or feelings of depression, things like that. So that kind of goes along with this logic that men seem to be more comfortable, at least in the beginning of treatment, with a very problem solution oriented frame. So maybe that might be a window in, you know, maybe start with coaching. And if you find that you like it and are ready to go deeper and want to actually dive into some of those emotions, things like that, maybe take that next step and go into therapy.
Yeah. I think a lot of perceptions about therapy is you're just going into the past and digging up a bunch of stuff that you don't want to deal with and then talking about how you feel about it.
Sure.
Without having a greater understanding of intervention and processes that might actually be helpful. So I think that's part of the reason why coaching might be more
palatable.
Exactly, for certain men than therapy.
Interesting. And I would maybe see it as the gateway drug to therapy.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. Ooh, also support groups. Men's support groups are hugely impactful because it creates a supportive network, a social network of people that you can rely on.
Group therapy is so fascinating. I know I just jumped from support group to group therapy, but still in that same logic, in our group therapy class, we were just learning so much about how the simple power of like sharing a space with someone who has been through or is going through what you are going through, just that by itself is so powerful for people because what empathy is crawling down into the foxhole with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So as amazing as individual therapy can be, there is something extra and special about group therapy is not just individual therapy times 10.
Right.
It's its own thing with its own science and its own benefits. And there's really an amazing benefit to, even if you don't consciously know that it's happening, when you are sharing experiences and opening up to other people in a space that share your struggles, that itself can be healing.
Yeah.
That can be the fix almost.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying with support groups, that could be a huge, if men are willing to, it's less anonymous. You go and you're seeing other people face to face, so that might be more vulnerable. But if you do it, it can be hugely helpful.
It might be more vulnerable and more scary at first, but once you hear other people like you sharing the same experiences that you have, it makes you feel less alone.
Oh my gosh, the feeling of aloneness will compound and exacerbate anything you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly, not that if you're a hypochondriac, stay away from Reddit, but if you're going through something, I have found it's so healing just to go on Reddit and type in the most niche, weird anxiety you think that you have. So many other people have had it too.
1,000%.
And reading through those threads makes you feel so much better because you're like, oh my God, I thought I was crazy. And in fact, that thing online, people always comment I've never had an individual experience.
Yes.
It's totally true. Everybody has been through the same crap.
Yeah.
100%.
It's so healing to know that there are other people going through the same thing and that you're not crazy.
Yeah.
That, in fact, you're probably normal.
Yeah. One more thing we wanted to get to is that idea of that hyper-independence we were talking about.
Yes.
Talk to me more about that.
Yeah. So there's an idea of, we could call it toxic independence, where you are so invested in your own self-sufficiency that you get so extreme in that you start rejecting social support and you can't be vulnerable, and therefore you're inhibiting your ability to connect with other people.
Because for some reason we've inherently defined independence as strength. When in fact, what if we take a step back and strip away everything we think we know? Can't you say that it's incredibly strong to form community?
Yes.
And to be sufficient together as a group or as a society, supporting each other? Why isn't that what we think of as strength?
I mean, I think it comes down to kind of zooming out on this more macro level. Here in the West,
it's capitalism.
It's we could jump into capitalism, but
Yeah.
it's this hyper-independent culture that we have where, like we were saying in the last episode, or I was saying in the last episode, where we're all satellites. Just kind of moving through space and not really bumping into each other, or sometimes even trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
But I think where we need to go is valuing relational connection. So with relational connection, we actually acknowledge the importance of interdependence, where we're still balancing and valuing our autonomy, but we're also allowing ourselves to have these meaningful, reciprocal relationships with other people. And it can help you to reframe your emotional strength, that you don't have to just hold everything in and just kind of muscle your way through it. You can actually lean on other people and build each other up as a unit. And then through that, you're building your emotional intelligence. So you can identify what it is that I'm feeling, not just default anger, happy, but really the complex, deep emotions, where they stem from, be able to convey those things to other people. And even better, you can recognize those things in others so that you can support them.
And be more attuned to what other people are going through, which just betters the world and society in general. If people are empathetic and able to recognize other people's experience, everything gets better.
It does.
And you have to be able to recognize your own experience in order to recognize somebody else's.
Exactly. You do. You absolutely need to be able to give it to yourself before you can recognize it in others.
You know what? My big thing about mental health is, like on an airplane, put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others. You have to know that you're taking care of yourself. That's why some people, are a little bit of a tangent, but people get incredibly burnt out being the caretaker to all except for themselves.
Right.
They're pouring out their cup without refilling it with anything. Yeah.
So ultimately, relational connection isn't about losing autonomy. It's about understanding that true strength comes from allowing yourself to be seen, supported, and understood.
That's really nice.
Let's talk about what healthy masculinity is. Because we've talked a lot about the potential deficits, but I think there's a lot of strength in masculinity. So we need to be shifting away from this more rigid, traditional idea of masculinity as dominance, as stoicism, and self-reliance toward a more expansive and emotionally intelligent perspective and a relational model. So modern masculinity really embraces vulnerability, emotional expression, and community without diminishing your strength and your resilience.
And there's a lot of qualities that also, by the way, do not have to be specific to men that women have as well, but that maybe we can reframe masculinity as instead of simply strength and control and authority. Maybe it can be things like responsibility and leadership and being reliable. So things like that are kind of like the relatives of those more traditional ideas. But I don't know, something about them feels a little bit more fluid and has a little bit more room for the man to also like take care of himself as a person and acknowledge his own emotional experience.
Yeah. I also want to validate that we're talking about almost a lot of shoulds. And I don't want it to come across that way because the truth is men have not been taught to do this. The opposite, like we were saying before, this example of, the father figure or a male role model modeling a version of masculinity that does not value emotional intelligence. There's nothing easy about now coming to terms with all of this and redefining what your role is in society, that it's not necessarily just what is it that you can financially provide, but it's your being, it's who you are. You're inherently lovable, you're inherently worthy.
And by the way, it's not only men who have to do this work, because something that a lot of women might still think these same things about masculinity.
Yeah.
So something that holds men back is they've had reactions from women in their life being like, oh, he's so emotional or he's so needy or like, I want a guy who's strong and independent. And
that's
it's like
the other side of it too.
Women have to do the work too to help us expand what is allowable and not shut the men in their life down. When the men start expressing emotions, some women will receive that, but a lot won't. And they have to be willing to expand their views of masculinity too.
1,000%.
To accept men in their life who are going through something and communicate that to them.
Because in the same ways that men haven't been taught to express these emotions, women haven't been taught how to receive it from men specifically.
Yeah.
Because there is still that expectation that men have to be strong and they have to be providers.
Yeah. And it's not sexy if your boyfriend is emotionally intelligent and vulnerable with you. But
it's so confusing because we're asking for both, right?
Right.
Like we're like, no, we want somebody who's emotionally intelligent and compassionate and kind. But then when that vulnerability comes out, like I feel like it's such a common experience where women are telling their male partners, I want you to open up to me. I want you to be vulnerable. And then they are, and then they don't know how to handle it.
Interesting.
So it comes from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. Okay, so we covered a lot. We attacked this at a lot of different angles. I know this is a conversation that's going to last years, and we just had it in an hour, but what would, for now, your main takeaway be talking about men's mental health?
Yeah, after reflecting on this whole conversation and everything that we've covered, because we covered a lot of ground, I think what my main takeaway is that this is the situation that we're in, and regardless of how we've gotten here, I think it's about how we move forward. And I don't want there to be a discussion about whether masculinity is good or bad. I think it just is. And the way that we go about expressing our masculinity and internalizing it is important. And I think there needs to be a little bit more support for men and understanding for men in that it's hard to navigate what it is to be a man in this society right now when so much is changing culturally. But what's your main takeaway?
I think it's important for men and for the women in their lives to be on the lookout. Because like we've talked about, traditionally having been taught what we've been taught, men might not even be aware of what they're going through, right? And that can get dangerous. We've talked about substance abuse. We've talked about the suicide rate. So I think the general takeaway from this conversation is starting to not change because, as you've said, there's nothing wrong with masculinity. It's not good or bad. It just is. I liked the way you said that. That was great. So not trying to break away from that, but trying to expand it trying to add more levels without, you don't have to change the current levels of what makes a guy, but just adding more to the definition.
Yeah.
Specifically, the ability to acknowledge what is the human freaking experience of going through crap and having unpleasant emotions.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, that is just part of being a human.
It is.
And being born a guy is not making you immune from that. And we all share this delusion that, like, men don't get sad. It's ridiculous. So I think holding on to what makes men proud of being men, while also adding more that you can make room for the human experience, and you can make room for admitting to yourself that you're going through something, admitting to the people in your life that you're going through something, and plugging, not just because we're therapists in training, but that men shouldn't be afraid of therapy. And I think it can be very helpful to start unpacking and untangling these things that we've been taught and passed down through the generations.
Right.
That would be my main takeaway, that the work is ongoing and we can keep chipping away at helping people get the help they need and making that more acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything else to say, or can I throw in a nugget of gold?
Let's do our nugget of gold.
I feel like we need to create a jingle that anytime we have one of those, it can be a nugget of gold segment. I did not expect you to title the last episode that. That was really funny.
Because we had talked about it.
For our listeners, the way that we usually do it is that I'll like edit the episode and like put it together into a final draft, and then I'll send it to my Elaine, and then she'll press the button to publish it. So she has the last say on things like title and things like that. And so I laughed very hard when I saw that title. I thought that was awesome. We were just talking about, I just wanted to share something that I thought was so interesting that we talked about in one of my classes. We were talking about trauma. And I was just thinking about it because earlier in this conversation, we were talking about passing on, if like men model for their sons how to handle mental health, and then that cycle continues. How generational trauma can happen and literally be passed down through generations. The analogy that our professor gave was mental and emotional trauma. Like, imagine if you break your arm and then you don't get it treated and it heals incorrectly. Your arm is still broken, and it's kind of like patched over, and you have a scar, but like your arm is still at a weird angle, and it hasn't healed correctly. So anytime you bump it, it's still in pain because it's still broken. That's the same thing with emotional or mental trauma. Because when we go through an experience normally, we have a very standard way of memory processing that happens. When you are in trauma, that memory of that traumatic event does not get stored in the normal or proper way, literally in your mind. It gets sent to different places. It doesn't get stored in the right place. So that arm remains broken, and that's why people get triggered so easily by things that remind them of that traumatic event. It's like if you bump the arm. Anytime you bump the arm, it sends a pain signal to your brain. It's the same thing with the traumatic memory. Anytime something bumps that memory, or what I mean is reminds you of it, even if slightly, you panic. You're back in that place because your brain hasn't been able to process it correctly to know that the danger has passed, that the danger is now stored. It's still, your brain treats it as very present, which is why things are so triggering.
Wow, that's so interesting.
I thought that was such a great analogy and such a great explanation of why people who get frustrated with themselves can be like, why does this thing still bother me? Why do I get panic attacks? Because it's not up to you. You haven't restored it yet. So your brain is still triggering you into fight or flight, which is why things like EMDR is so helpful. Because what it's doing, you're revisiting that traumatic memory, but in a non-activated way. You are shutting down the fight or flight so that you can literally take it out of the incorrect file cabinet and reprocess it into the correct file cabinet in your brain. So that afterwards you're no longer, if, through treatment, if it becomes successful, you're no longer being triggered, because in a non-fight or flight setting, you have been able to reprocess that emotion and store it in the correct place. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because I thought it was so interesting, in our conversation about passing down trauma, things like that just made me think of it. And I think there's always a nice place for a nugget of gold. How you feeling?
I feel good. I feel like there's a lot of nuggets of gold in this episode.
Yeah, this was a good one. This was fun. And an ongoing conversation. This, doesn't yet have a beginning, middle, and end. This is society,
Yeah. it just evolves over time, and we ebb and we flow with it, and we figure out what works for us.
Yeah. I can't wait to start hearing about your practicum.
I cannot wait to share all the things about practicum.
It's going to be great. So exciting. All right. Are we ready to wrap up?
I guess so.
By the way, we've been having, I said this last episode, but we've been getting awesome messages. We've gotten like international messages from people who are studying psychology across the ocean and have been enjoying the podcast. It means a lot to hear how this is landing, and it makes me even more excited to keep going with it.
It feels like magic.
Yeah.
Like I feel like we have this little bit of magic that we get to share with the world, and then you guys are giving it back to us.
Yeah.
So please keep up with the engagement. We love to get your questions. We love to hear from you. We love to know what you like about the podcast. So please.
And by the way, if you ever do, we've gotten a handful of questions that we haven't talked about on the pod yet because we haven't said this yet. If you are okay with us referencing your question on the pod, we would love to do like a Q&A, like a question answer with active listeners. So if you're okay with that, let us know in your question and we can fold it into one of our episodes.
Yeah, please do. That would be so fun.
Alrighty, shall we?
All right, we shall.
Let's do it. I'm Michael.
I'm Mylene.
And this has been Therapy in Progress.
Thank you for coming to class with us.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Bye. Therapy in Progress is produced for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to substitute for professional medical or mental health care.
Views expressed here are our own. If you're in need of support, we encourage you to reach out to a licensed professional.
Your mental health matters. Talk to you next time.